Yeah, it's better. Sorry. If you catch Jesus on a bad day, it's all about earthquakes and famines and war, and that's just the beginning. I mean, maybe they were just trying to make conversation with him. Look at that lovely building. It's going to be destroyed. Everything's going to be destroyed. Okay. I mean, he's right, but just because he's telling the truth doesn't mean we want to hear that, right? Carol and I just watched a movie that I can't say the full title of in church, but we're going to call it My Old Self. Okay, self is not a word that can be said in church. I mean, that one can, but the word, anyway. So the premise of the movie is that there's one way I think many of us have thought of, right? So what would happen if your future self could visit you now? Or if you could go back and talk to a past version of yourself? What would you tell them? What would you want to know? And putting aside the obvious troubles with time travel movies, right? Because if your older self visited you, then won't you have a memory of that as your older self? Because, anyway, now we're in metaverses or something, I don't know. But it still raises interesting questions, right? Like, what would you want to know about your future, if you could, from yourself? Or what would you tell yourself? Could you convince yourself to change? And would you want to? And how do you handle the inevitable parts of life that aren't great, right? It's not about when something bad's going to happen in your life. It's about, not about if something bad is going to happen in your life. It's about when, right? So would you want to know about the bad things that happen in your life? Or would you rather be kept in ignorance? And if you do know, what are you going to do about it? Because the reality is that the world's always ending, right? In small and big ways. How many earthquakes and famines and kingdoms at war against one another have you seen just in your lifetime, right? This is the nature of our world, unfortunately. We destroy each other and we destroy creation. And it's not just when we're alive, it's been much of human history. And within our lifetime, there are so many times where it feels like our world has ended, right? There's car accidents and career changes and cancer, things that fundamentally alter everything about the way that you live. And some of those things can be good, like the birth of a child or the beginning of a new relationship. But the world as you know it, when those things happen, has ended. And of course, one day, I hope this is not news, but one day our world will end. And maybe there'll be some kind of collective event that looks like, the last, what was that series of books back in the Last Days series of books, whatever. But the reality is each of us will die, right? You may be the one person who's immortal, so congratulations. But even if that happens, everybody you love is going to die, right? Endings, death, is a part of human life. And what are we supposed to do about that? See, I don't think Jesus was trying to terrify us with all this talk of the end of the world. I think in a way he was trying to prepare us, right? To help us understand how to live within a mortal context, right? Within a world that is always changing, always beginning and always ending. I think about Hannah, right? Pouring her soul out before the Lord. That's what the scriptures say. Forget famines and earthquakes. How many times have you been there? Just desperate, right? Please, God, I want so much for this thing or this thing not to happen or whatever it might be. So desperate that they thought that she had been drinking in the front steps of the church, right? But instead, she was just praying, pouring everything out. And Hannah eventually had the child that she'd been praying for, maybe not in the timeline she had been hoping for. But even when God answers our prayers in different ways than we had asked for or at a different time, those prayers, the answers to them change us, right? They change how we understand the universe. Because in Hannah's song, which is what we read as the psalm today, which sounds a lot like a song that Mary sings in about a month, but we'll leave that alone. She talks about how she understands the world, right? That her soul, her heart, I don't remember quite how she says it, cries out to God. And she understands that God is going to bring up those who are poor and take down those who are taking advantage of people. She knows that in all the changes that happen in this life, the good and the bad, that God is a part of that, and God is doing what God knows is best. You see, all the apocalyptic literature, all the parts of the Bible that talk about the end of the world, the book of Daniel, the book of Revelations, a whole lot of what Paul's writing about in his letters, right? It's actually supposed to be good news, right? It's supposed to be hopeful. I know it doesn't always seem that way, but the idea is that someday God's going to show up and make things right? Because we know things aren't right? They're not the way we want them to be. And we're working, we're praying, we're trying. But no matter how hard we try or work or pray, sometimes the only thing that's going to fix the situation is God. And so all these writers, they wrote about it as a reminder to us that God is going to show up and God is going to make things right. And all that dragons and epic wars, and it's just their own version of a sci-fi movie, right? To remind us that God is present. Because in these moments, we have all that we have, right? So this moment is gone, right? That's how time works, despite what the sci-fi movies try to tell you. So how then are we to live with a life that is constantly passing, constantly being changed? There's a semisonic band, they sing a song called Closing Time, right? Which you would think is about when a bar closes, because that's what closing time usually is. Well, in fact, the lead singer wrote the song about the birth of his first child, right? And the next time you hear the song, which may be never, because you may not be a semisonic fan, but you'll hear some words like, this door won't be open until your brother or sisters come, that you'll be like, oh, that makes a lot more sense now that you told me that's about the birth of a child. But the refrain of the song is, every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. That's why when we start the season of Advent, we always talk about the end of the world. And don't worry, we still have 2 weeks till Advent. The altar guild didn't mess up. We don't go blue for 2 weeks. But that royal blue isn't just about preparing for the birth of our King. It's about a season of preparation, about contemplation and how we find light in the midst of darkness. I've heard some people talk about Advent as the darkness of the womb, right? There's a darkness and a sadness and a contemplation to that period, but it's all in service of preparing us for a birth and a celebration. Because even those good moments in our lives are moments of change and transformation. See, the question isn't how do we stop bad things from happening, or what can we do to get our future self to somehow travel back in time and tell us about what's going to happen so we can be prepared for it. The question is, how do we live now? And Hebrews talks about that, the letter to the Hebrews, right? As we're waiting for whatever God has in store for us next, we keep our hope and we support one another. That's what it is to live at these end days, whatever they may be. The world is always ending, and the world is always beginning. But always, there is God. Reminding us, as one of my favorite prayers from the prayer book says, that in the changes and chances of this life, we can rest in God's eternal changelessness.